So what we want to start to focus on is how to go about studying a habitat. So how to conduct a habitat study. So just some of the steps, we're going to look at some of the steps between this lesson and the next one on how do we actually go about studying a habitat. And this is what like ecologists, that's what they would do. They would actually pick a habitat and they would go about studying it and investigating it and seeing, what kind of animals are there or organisms are present, and they look at the relationship between the organisms within the habitat. So step one then. So step one. Step one is going to be which habitat are you going to study? So which habitat will you study? So it could be things like, would it be your local park? Or local field? It could be the school grounds. Or it could even be your garden. So the first thing really that we do when we're studying a habitat is decide what type of habitat we're going to study. And all of these habitats here will be what are known as, they come under the collective term as grassland. So the first part is very straightforward. It's just deciding, what habitat you're going to actually study. The second part then is, so let's say you've picked your garden, for example. So you're going to have, imagine this is your garden here. You want it, so you might not be able to study the whole garden, okay, because it might be quite a big space and there's a lot to study there. Or for example, if it's your local park or a local field, it's going to be huge, so you're not going to study every single part of it. So step two then is really, you want to decide, step two is going to be deciding then how much of the habitat do you study. So you're not going to go and study the whole thing. You want to decide what section of it or how much of it are you going to study. So one thing you can do is you can pick like a section. So imagine you have a piece of the grassland and you can put down, for example, 4 pegs and you can cordon off this little piece here. And you can decide to study just this little section here within the garden, for example. So this, for example, it could be like a section of the garden that's about, let's say, 100 meters by 20 meters. So you're just picking one portion of that and you're going to focus in on that piece. And it's important to kind of mark it out then as well. Like have 4 pegs or 4 just boundaries so that you can see where your study starts and where your study ends. So once you've kind of picked your habitat and you've decided how much of the habitat you're going to study and you've kind of marked out your little section, the next thing then that you kind of want to do is so step 3 would be, step 3 is going to be, you want to measure what are called the abiotic factors. And we're going to talk about what this means, abiotic. So abiotic factors affecting that. affecting the habitat. So measuring these abiotic factors. So abiotic factors. So what do we mean, like what are abiotic factors? So some examples of abiotic factors are air temperature. So air temperature, soil temperature. We have like soil pH and light intensity. So these are all things, these are collectively what are known as abiotic factors. And again, this is just a term, it's a new term that you need to learn what it is. So if we're to look at like what the actual definition of an abiotic factor is, so abiotic factors are the non-living. So non-living, so that's what we mean by abiotic. So a meaning not and bio meaning life, so it's not living. So abiotic things that affect organisms in their habitat. And so they're non-living things, so you can say, and these are the examples of them then. So abiotic factors, so again, really, really important. Again, this is just a term that ecologists use when they're describing like factors that can affect an organism within the environment. So if you were to take, for example, if you're to look at your garden, for example, and you're to look at a particular section, so you might be looking at, for example, how does the air temperature, depending on where you live, like does that air temperature, like how does that impact on the organisms that are living within this environment? If it's too hot, some organisms might not like that. If it's too cold, some other organisms might not like that. Just the temperature of the soil. So, for example, if it's very hot and the ground is very dry, for example, it might not be the best environment for earthworms. The pH then, that's like a measurement of how acidic or basic or neutral the ground is. So again, some organisms will like acidic, will like acid environments, other organisms will like basic environments. Light intensity then, so for example, you might have like part of your garden there might be no shade, so it's getting the full belt of the sun, let's say during the summer, and some organisms might not like that. Other organisms will love that. So, for example, if you're a cold-blooded creature, like lizards and things like that, they like to be out in the sun because they can't heat up their own body. So they like to use the heat from the sun to heat their body. But if you're an organism that doesn't like being in the sun, you might stay in the shade of a tree, for example. So all those factors are going to have a big impact on the organism, let's say, that lives within that environment. So when we talk about abiotic factors, we're basically talking about the non-living things that affect organisms, and these are some examples of those things. And like for each of these abiotic factors, then you're going to have different instruments to measure each of these guys. So for example, for air temperature and soil temperature, you might just use a thermometer, and you can just place the thermometer in the ground or place the thermometer in the air. This soil pH, you can use litmus paper or strips, for example, or you can even use, there's digital pH meters that you can use to test the pH. And then light intensities then as well, you have different sensors and light intensity sensors that can pick up like how intense light is hitting a particular area. kind of like your preliminary steps to studying a habitat. So you pick your habitat, the habitat that you want to study. You decide how much of the habitat you're going to study. So you want to section it off, maybe a small, you can use 4 pegs or whatever to section off a piece of your habitat. You then want to go and measure what are called your abiotic factors within the environment. So the abiotic factors then are the non-living things that affect organisms in the habitat. Now, so they're like, let's say, the first 3 steps. So these are our first 3 steps. So step 1, step 2, and step 3. So just in the next lesson then, what I want to talk about is we're going to go on and look at what are called producers, for example. So you have within a habitat, you have organisms that are called producers, you have organisms that are called consumers, and you have organisms that are called decomposers. And what I want to do is I want to kind of talk about each of these in turn as well. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at this idea of like identifying producers within a habitat, and what are producers and how do we identify them. And that's what we'll talk about in the next lesson. But for now, just as an introduction, so this will be your first 3 steps, let's say, within studying a habitat. And the next step that we're going to look at is step 4, which will be identifying what are called producers, and we're going to talk about what producers are. So okay, so we've just learned a couple of new kind of terms here as well. So this is really important that you know this. So abiotic factors, they're non-living things that affect organisms in their habitat, and these are examples of abiotic factors that can affect an organism. So thank you for listening.